And welcome into Third Round Reversal, our very first episode here. We wanted to give an extreme look at both Dynasty and Redraft. And so we're launching our very own podcast. Brett Malamud here with Zach Malamud. And Zach, how you doing?
I'm doing great. Ready for our first episode.
Yeah, so we're a couple weeks out. The NFL draft has happened. The schedules have been revealed this weekend, and we're going to take a look now. Let's go through some of the guys that were picked and then explain kind of what their dynasty outlook would be as well as their redraft look. Let's start with first overall quarterback Bryce Young, taken by the Carolina Panthers. Zach, what's your outlook on him?
So Bryce Young, I mean, the accuracy is the one thing that stands out from Bryce Young. Very similar to a couple of Alabama quarterbacks before him, Mac Jones, as well as Tua Tagovailoa. Of course, the size is a concern maybe for a lot of teams on Bryce Young. However, I mean, everything else besides the size just screams an unbelievable quarterback. And I mean, in Dynasty, it's definitely something to look out for, a guy like Bryce Young.
Yeah, I think Bryce Young's probably the best out of the quarterbacks. He has a really, really high floor. Everyone's been talking about size concerns, but I don't know that the size concerns actually will translate to him being a bad quarterback. He really does a good job of protecting himself, which a lot of those guys, like the Baker Mayfields, the Kyler Murrays, didn't really do a good job of. He's not a Kyler Murray type of player. I think he's a little more balanced in the pocket. He has the ability to rush, which makes him different. It's more like a Russell Wilson, but obviously he doesn't have Russell Wilson's arm. He can fit the ball in the tight window. He's probably a guy that you should be able to pick up midway through your redraft, but he's probably the top quarterback right now in Dynasty for me. So
he's the kind of guy at number one that's going to slot in right away as the starting quarterback in Carolina, you would think. Just not enough around them. With Andy Dalton is probably going to be backing him up. And they got a couple of younger quarterbacks in Matt Corral and Jacob Eason. But Carolina did a good job in the offseason grabbing some weapons for Bryce Young. Miles Sanders, the running back from Philadelphia. They also ended up grabbing Adam Thielen from Minnesota, and they even added a new tight end in Hayden Hurst. So they're giving Bryce Young a bunch of options. So, I mean, there's a positive outlook going into year one in this Carolina offense.
Yeah, and don't forget about Jonathan Mingo, who they picked early in that draft as well. I think that for him, a lot of these guys, they come in, they don't have a ton of weapons, which we'll talk about CJ Stroud in a minute, who doesn't have as many. But I think he's really been surrounded with some good talent. So again, I would pick him, middle of your rounds in redraft, with the potential there that he does make a splash. And then he's my top quarterback right now in Dynasty. All right, let's get to the second pick. It was the Texans. Everybody was curious what they were going to do in the draft. And of course, they kind of plugged out there that they were going to pick a defender, and instead they picked CJ Stroud at number 2. They come back up at 3 to get Will Anderson. But let's talk about CJ Stroud because I know we're kind of differing in our opinions on him. So let's hear your take.
So my thing on CJ Stroud is the thing that stands out for me is the decision making, because I think he struggled mightily with that at Ohio State. There were a lot of instances where, I mean, just big time moment, and it kind of hurt him when he made a bad decision. Of course, the biggest moment of his year and probably his career at Ohio State was against Georgia. Probably had the game of his life in the college football playoff semifinal. Played an unbelievable game, no doubt, and absolutely carried Ohio State in that one. But I do think the decision-making, it's a problem for especially quarterbacks, even with the size and strength that Stroud has. If he can't make correct decisions, it's difficult to see him to be a starting quarterback for such a long time.
Yeah, so, I mean, we just kind of go through the stats here. Stroud, he throws the ball a ton. Doesn't really use the legs as much, but he had the second highest yards per attempt in the entire country. He really, really shined at the combine with his accuracy. It was what all the scouts were talking about. Again, putting it in that tight window. This guy is the guy who does that. There's not as much rushing upside, but he's going to have to learn how to use his legs because, as we kind of mentioned before, he doesn't really have a ton of weapons. Not to say that they're schlubs, but they're not exactly. You're not exactly getting that top kind of talent that you are. Some of the other quarterbacks are. So he's gonna have to learn how to use his legs. A lot of comparisons out there right now are to Justin Herbert, a guy who, again, he really doesn't use his legs, but he does when he needs to. If the rushing ability does come along, keep an eye on him later in the season for the waiver wire in terms of redraft. But for dynasty purposes, I still think he's one of those first few off the board. It's kind of that debate whether he's number 2 or number 3. We'll get into Anthony Richardson in a second, but I really think that Stroud, the potential is high. There's the potential that Houston does not do well this season. They're positioned up high in the draft. They can grab one of those receivers that's coming out next year, Marvin Harrison Jr., etc. And if he does get surrounded with some of that talent, I really think that they can make some noise with him and he'll be able to be successful. Now, the thing with him, he has the running game going for him. He has Dameon Pierce on his team. They just brought in Devin Singletary. I'm curious, what are your thoughts on that and how that might be able to free him up a little bit to have room to pass the ball?
Yeah, so Houston did a good job in the offseason being able to grab some running backs. Of course, the experience. Dameon Pierce heading into his second year now. Devin Singletary from Buffalo. Mike Boone from Denver. I mean, they added some pretty experienced backs in this offseason, and I think that'll help Stroud. Obviously, you don't want to put too much pressure on your rookie quarterback, force him to throw way too much in his rookie season because, of course, that's when the mistakes are going to come. So if they put him in the best possible situation, allow him to hand off the ball to those running backs, it's definitely going to help him out in his rookie season. Of course, looking at Dynasty, he has to be either top 2, top 3, maybe top 4 in drafts because of the value, the ceiling that he has, obviously the potential. Like I said, my one if is the decision making. However, if he has those running backs behind him, I don't think it's too much to worry about in his rookie year. Maybe a little bit more in the future.
Yeah, and it's a good point. I mean, we're going to talk about Anthony Richardson in a second, but again, that decision making, if he can get himself going, he's one of the most accurate passers that is coming into the draft in the last couple of years. All right, let's head to the 4th pick as the Indianapolis Colts took probably the most interesting pick of the draft, Anthony Richardson, quarterback out of Florida. And Zach, this guy is polarizing. He was projected to go in the 2nd round when the mock drafts first started coming out, and he kind of went from there to a mid-round, like 20th pick, and then he kind of flipped all the way up to the top 10, and there he was, number 4 pick. Really surprising. What are your thoughts on Anthony Richardson and his rise to the top 5 in the draft?
Yeah, it definitely caught me by surprise. I'm not gonna lie. I had Will Levis going a lot earlier, and the Colts actually drafting Will Levis instead of Anthony Richardson. It was a little bit surprising. However, looking at the stuff he did at the NFL Combine, I mean, there was nobody better than Anthony Richardson at the quarterback position. He was unbelievable, and really made these NFL franchises keep an eye on him in the 1st round of this year's draft. Of course, the ability with his legs is unbelievable. Obviously, he had that at Oregon, and then when he transferred to Florida this past year, of course, the legs stand out. The throwing ability is a bit of a concern. However, with his legs, and especially in this type of NFL where a lot of mobile quarterbacks, I think the Colts will be able to figure it out with him in the offense.
Yeah, so Florida did something interesting with him, which a lot of these quarterbacks that are coming into the league don't really do. There were a couple that do, but there's those predetermined passing plays. So his first option is going to be open within 2 seconds. Zach Wilson had one at BYU a couple of years ago, came into the NFL, wasn't exactly going the way for him. He's only got 1 year starting experience, Anthony Richardson. So that's another knock on him. But of course, he's just a polarizing prospect. He's really good at rolling out to the right, not as well rolling out to the left. So we'll see if defenses can adjust to that. But his strong side is to the right, and so they will design a lot of rollouts for him, I'm sure, going that way. But he can launch the ball. I mean, there was that video that came out about a day after the draft, him standing on the opposite 40-yard line and just throwing it, planted feet, didn't move, no, crow hop or anything like that. And he just threw it into the end zone, 60 yards, legs planted. That was crazy. If he can refine his accuracy, he can be amazing. I mean, Lamar Jackson with an arm is what the comp would be. We've seen the opposite of those kind of guys, though, coming in, those RG3s, Lamar, who have been able to come into the league and run, but, they get injured. And we've seen that with Lamar, which is, why the whole contract situation and guaranteed money and all of that came about. But if Anthony Richardson can refine his accuracy, he's going to be a great quarterback. He has the lowest floor, though, because of the running game. So, yes, he's going to be treated as one of those, again, mid-round, I would say, in redraft. I wouldn't pick him super, super high. I know that a lot of people are going to overrate him. But in redraft, I don't know that you can really do that. In Dynasty, however, this is where the interesting debate becomes, do you take the guy with the higher ceiling but also has the lower floor? So let's compare the three guys, Young, Stroud, and then Anthony Richardson, and what you think of each guy compared to each other.
So it's interesting. I mean, I think Young is clearly the top guy of these three. Of course, everything that he brings to the table, and obviously the one concern is the size, but I don't think that's going to matter too much for Bryce Young because, like you mentioned before, a lot of the difference between him and Kyler Murray and Tua Tagovailoa is he knows how to get out of bad situations, avoid getting injured. Of course, it's not as easy going into the NFL. There's going to be a lot of defensive tackles, big guys on the line trying to go at him, but he's clearly number one. The difference right now between Stroud and Richardson is, do you want more passing or do you want more rushing? So obviously there's more points that come from rushing in fantasy football versus passing. However, if Stroud's passing all the time or almost all the time, he's going to rack up numbers that I think might outduel what Anthony Richardson is able to do. But the two together of passing and rushing from Richardson is definitely something to look at. For this year, this rookie year, I'm going to actually put Richardson ahead of Stroud because I think he's in a better situation than Stroud is in Houston. I think Indianapolis can give him a guy like Michael Pittman where he can just go and it does not matter the accuracy, anything like that. He could throw it in 2 seconds and he's got a guy in Michael Pittman that could get the job done for him.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, again, I agree with you. I would say that Richardson's probably the highest because of the situation in terms of redraft. But I'll say that Young's definitely the best of the three. Again, we talked size concerns, we talked weapons. I think that group for him makes him the top guy in Dynasty. And of course, they're going to keep adding to it. I mean, Carolina, they have some smart staff that they brought in over there. Frank Reich, he's a smart guy. And so he's going to surround the quarterback with talent. Stroud, again, he's not surrounded with schlubs. Nico Collins, Robert Woods they brought in. Mechie's coming back. They drafted Tank Dell. It's a good group of guys. There's no game changers there that are going to command target share or anything like that. So he's going to have to spread the ball around. And again, he's going to have to learn how to use his legs. But the floor is higher. So I think he's the safest, actually, of the three picks is Stroud. Richardson's that swing for the fences type of guy. If it pays off, you got your Lamar Jackson, Hurts, Josh Allen, but it's a huge if. Again, longevity we spoke about. They lost Paris Campbell. they replaced him with Isaiah McKenzie. They picked Josh Downs, Pittman, and Pierce. So it's a very iffy situation for Richardson, and he wasn't exactly proven when he was at Florida. So again, I would pick him if he's your second or third quarterback in a super flex. And I would pick Stroud over him again because that floor is higher than Richardson's, where the ceiling might be different. So let's now jump into your favorite prospect, Bijan Robinson, who got picked 7th overall by the Atlanta Falcons, or 8th overall by the Atlanta Falcons. Should he go 1st overall in redraft league, Zach?
In redraft leagues, I mean, I don't think so. Of course, yeah, there's so much potential now in this Atlanta offense, and of course, you throw in a guy like Bijan Robinson who trucked through the college football world this past year. Of course, 20 touchdowns from scrimmage, 1,894 yards. Just the numbers scream this guy's going to be unbelievable when he gets into the NFL. Of course, the longevity of running backs is a different story. We'll talk about that when we get to Dynasty. But for redraft, I don't think Bijan goes too high. I think he'll be on the lower end of first rounds. I think that's a safe spot for him. It's not too big, but it's not okay second round and we don't really care about him. He's going to be the lead guy in Atlanta. They are going to feed him like there's no tomorrow. They really do not have a lot in that offense, and they have to figure something out right now on offense. Of course, Kyle Pitts is there at tight end, but finding a quarterback is still even a small question right now. Who's going to be the starter? Who's going to be the lead guy? But they have a running back. So as long as you can hand the ball off, I mean, a guy like Bijan Robinson is probably best case scenario for the Falcons going into this year.
And I know that Pitt's owners and, of course, London owners, Drake London, probably were a little upset knowing that Bijan was coming. They were probably going to lean a little more into the run. But Pitts is a good blocker. I mean, obviously it doesn't have a dynasty redraft effect, a fantasy football effect, but Pitts is a good blocker. So I think it is a good fit for them. And they'll be able to run the ball and pound the rock. You mentioned 2022, he had 20 total touchdowns. And so 6.1 yards per carry. He's a guy who really will get a ton of points, a ton of looks. And again, it's not a great look if you have a guy like Drake London or you have a guy like Kyle Pitts. You pick them high, but at the same time, they're going to have to figure out how to throw the ball because they're probably going to stack the box a bit on Bijan. So it's interesting that you say he's at the back end of the first round. I wrote down 9 guys. I'm going to list them out for you. With Bijan being the 10th guy, you're going to tell me, would you rather have this guy or Bijan? And that'll kind of help us place where we think he might go in that first round for your redraft leagues. All right, so would you rather have him or Christian McCaffrey?
Christian McCaffrey.
Okay. I would take McCaffrey as well. What about Austin Eckler?
I'd rather have Austin Eckler just because of the impact he had this past year.
Yeah, I agree with that as well. All right, Justin Jefferson.
So that's an interesting one. However, Jefferson is clear, probably number 1, I would say, in wide receivers going into this year in redraft.
Yeah, I think Jefferson, for me, he's a guy who gets you a floor of 20 points every week. And I'll take the 20 points rather than, one week that the Falcons might struggle to be able to move the ball down the field. So yeah, I would take Jefferson as well. All right, what about another wide receiver, Cooper Kupp?
I would take Cooper Kupp most likely. Of course, the injuries were a problem a year ago. Really couldn't stay on the field for the back half of last season. But the front half was unbelievable numbers. And he could have been, I think, the number 1 guy in all of fantasy football if he stayed on the field for the rest of the season.
Yeah, and it would have been like 2 years in a row because there was that previous season where he was ahead of the second guy by like 100 points. And so, yeah, I would take Cooper Kupp as well. Again, you're looking at that potential. And his quarterback's healthy again. And we'll, knock on wood that Matt Stafford stays healthy. But, that's an interesting case as well. All right, a third wide receiver. Let's go Jamar Chase.
So I would probably take Jamar Chase as well. Of course, the amount of weapons in that Cincinnati offense, you got to feed a lot of guys in that offense, especially now with Joe Mixon having a great season last season. Um, but the ceiling of Jamar Chase, I mean, you get 70-yard touchdowns like it's nothing. So I think that for Jamar Chase puts him ahead of Bijan.
Yeah, I agree as well. I think that the ceiling's too high, and enough said there. All right, now let's take a look at what about Jonathan Taylor? It's a guy who, a lot of people were very disappointed at the end of the last season.
So the question with Jonathan Taylor is, of course, if Anthony Richardson is the starting quarterback, because obviously the rushing could take an impact because Richardson's running out of the pocket, putting up numbers, some more read options maybe for Anthony Richardson. I would still take Taylor for now because obviously the Colts offensive line and their situation in front of Jonathan Taylor is set up, I think, pretty perfectly right now. I think they downgraded a bit from last year. However, of course, having that offensive line that you can trust, I would go with Taylor there.
This is where I'm going to draw my line in the sand. I was one of those Jonathan Taylor first overall pick last year. I really think that you make a great point with Anthony Richardson. I think Richardson is going to be one of those guys who's doing a lot of those read options. I also really think that those red zone carries will be Anthony Richardson, similar to what happened with Jalen Hurts last year in Philly, where he was kind of taking away the carries within the 5-yard line and taking those touchdowns away. I think that will really be the big effect on Jonathan Taylor. So I'm going to take Bijan on that one. I think that's probably a guy I would take because I think the touchdown numbers are going to be higher. Therefore, the fantasy points will be higher. All right, another one who's sort of been banged up the last couple years. We're unsure about his future from a dynasty perspective, but a year from now, it could look totally different in Tennessee. Derrick Henry, a guy who you've had on your team for a while, and you recently got rid of the stock and cut your losses with him. Well, what are your thoughts on him this year in redraft?
So I would actually see, this is interesting because I would actually draw the line right here with Bijan over Derrick Henry. The one thing about Derrick Henry now, and I think he's almost in his 30s, so he's getting up there. The age is getting there. I think the injuries are going to start to come. Obviously, you don't hope for injuries for any player, but I think Derrick Henry, a guy who's had a past with injuries, of course, didn't happen too much last season, but the seasons before that, he was held out for a while, obviously missed the rest of the season a couple of years ago. I think taking Bijan is probably a safer option this year. Of course, Derrick Henry, I mean, you can't really go wrong with him. However, I think Bijan's going to be playing a lot of snaps, getting the job done. And Tennessee has figured out now that they can't rely solely on Derrick Henry. They need to pass the ball, especially if they want to make it into the playoffs and try and get far in the playoffs. They have to have a passing game of some sort.
Yeah, it could be a really long year out there in Tennessee. I'm curious to see what happens, and they can't just rely on Derrick Henry. They really just can't. They've been pushing him for 20 plus carries, 25 carries a game for the last three seasons, 4 seasons almost. And I think this is we're watching the end of Derrick Henry's reign as that guy, and he's been banged up a ton. So again, I'll take Bijan over him as well. Now we talk Travis Kelce. What are our thoughts here? This is kind of one of those back into the first round, early second rounders. But again, that floor is way higher than that even second tight end. So do you value that over Bijan?
So I'm not a fan of taking tight ends really high in redrafts. I mean, it's difficult because Kelce has such a big impact on that offense with Mahomes. Of course, he puts up the numbers, not even close to the second best tight end, Travis Kelce. But I would probably take Bijan in that situation, just the running back. You don't have to rely on a quarterback always throwing. I mean, with Bijan being the top guy, of course, Algier is maybe going to get a couple carries here and there. However, you're relying each time that Patrick Mahomes snaps the ball that he's going to throw it to Travis Kelce. It's not going to happen every time. There's 4 other guys on the field. So I'm not huge on taking a tight end in the first round. Of course, Kelce has the ability, the ceiling to be unbelievable. But I think Bijan, his ceiling as the lead running back in Atlanta, I think outweighs what Kelce will do for the Chiefs.
Yeah, I agree. I think that we've seen the last couple of years, there's been some tight ends who have been able to put up numbers, and obviously you don't really compare that to what Kelce's been able to put up. But in terms of you competing against other teams, it's fine to have a Mark Andrews on your team. It's fine to have a Dallas Goedert on your team rather than Kelce, where you might be able to upgrade at running back, one of those positions that breaks the bank. One of those first couple guys off the board, break the bank certain week and kind of give you some wins. So I would take Bijan over Kelce as well. Okay, our last one, Saquon Barkley, who was a guy who was picked in the second round and kind of, he really came into his own. I think he was running back 3 in a lot of leagues towards the end. The health and the contract and all that. Well, what are your thoughts on taking Bijan over him?
So, of course, I mean, the health concerns are the biggest thing when it comes to Saquon Barkley. However, now the biggest concern is playing for the Giants because, I mean, obviously he didn't get the contract he wanted. He's very frustrated about it, and it might impact his season this year. Of course, I'm going to take Bijan in that situation because of the situation he's in. He's more comfortable probably than Saquon is in New York right now. Of course, the ability of Saquon when he is healthy, he is unbelievable. And you can compare these guys very closely. Their abilities on the field are ridiculous. However, I take the younger version of those two because I think he can have a bigger impact, the speed, the quickness, anything like that. Bijan has the advantage because of his age compared to Saquon.
Yeah, I think that, again, that unknown side of the Saquon Barkley situation really makes it easy to take Bijan here. Again, I think Bijan is going to get a ton of touchdowns. I'm kind of curious what the Giants do this year. Daniel Jones started to run a little bit more. Maybe that kind of takes away a little bit from Saquon. So yeah, I'm going with the safe situation. Bijan is a known commodity. And he hasn't even played a game, which is funny to say that he's a known commodity. He hasn't played a game in the NFL yet. But I take him Saquon. So I think that put him sixth for us. It's, that mid first round, which is probably where I think that he'll go in a lot of leagues. But as far as a dynasty perspective, let's talk Bijan just for a second here. He's got to be the first overall pick, I would assume, in redraft leagues, like pretty much across the board, or not draft league, in regular dynasty 1 quarterback leagues. But in that super flex, do you take him over that quarterback position? Because I probably would.
So it's interesting because of course a dynasty league, I mean, 1 quarterback and then a super flex as well. That's a question. I would definitely take Bijan at number 1. However, what I will say, it depends on the situation of a dynasty team. If you're in a situation where you have one really good quarterback, but then you need a second quarterback to rely on, and your running backs and wide receivers are okay, and they fit what you're looking for your dynasty team, then you have to take a quarterback at number 1. However, my personal situation, I have 2 quarterbacks. I have Justin Fields and Justin Herbert, 2 guys that I think I can rely on for the next 5-10 years pretty easily, in my opinion. And for that reason, I think Bijan clearly should be the number 1 guy based on the situation with with two really solid quarterbacks, I think Bijan has to be the number one overall pick.
Yeah, here's what I'll say. I think that you speak the truth when you say if it depends on the situation. I think that if you need a quarterback, try to trade down a pick or two. If you have number one pick and you don't want to take Bijan, because somebody's going to trade up to try to get him. Obviously, I wouldn't trade all the way down because then you're probably going to miss out on those couple quarterbacks. But if you're in a super flex league, you probably want to trade down one or two picks, so at least you guarantee yourself one of those two or three quarterbacks get the choice if you only trade down a pick, and you still rack up somebody gets Bijan and trades up for him. Yeah, I would say that I think he is the number one pick across all formats. And if you need to make your trade, you make that trade. So interesting one who fell out of the first round. Let's just talk Will Levis for a second. He's an interesting case. Everybody thought he was going to go in the top 5, or a lot of people did. And a lot of people thought that when he did slide out, that somebody was going to trade up for him, and nobody did. So he falls out of the first round, and then phone rings at the beginning of the second round, and the Tennessee Titans trade up for him. And does it speak volumes for the confidence in Tannehill?
I think it does a little bit for now. I think that might be a plan for the future, Will Levis. I think Tannehill, it kind of proved that Tannehill is probably going to be the number one guy so far for this year. They still have a little bit of confidence in him. Of course, staying on the field is a big thing for Tannehill, and a lot of mistakes from Tannehill recently as Tennessee tried to pass the ball a little bit more in that offense. I do think Tannehill is going to be the quarterback this year of Tennessee, just based on they drafted Levis in the second round. They could have drafted him in the first, but they felt like, okay, we're not too high on him. And if he falls in the second round, yeah, maybe we trade up to get him. He'll be the backup for this year. Of course, they have Malik Willis as well, the quarterback out of Liberty, who really struggled last year, came in for 3 or 4 games and just was awful on the field. And then they went with Josh Dobbs for another game where they played the Cowboys, picked him up and threw him in at quarterback because they were just begging for something, Tennessee. But I think Will Levis is the backup for now behind Tannehill. And if Tannehill makes some sort of mistake, then Levis can come in and I guess show what he has.
Yeah, it's funny because they picked Malik Willis and everybody was so high on him. And I think his value just absolutely cratered in dynasty purposes. I think that they think Will Levis will be better than him, which is obviously why they traded up for him. This is a situation where I think that I agree. I think he's going to sit. He'll probably sit for the year. If Tannehill struggles, he might come in, week 8, 9, 10-ish. But only if they really, really struggle to the point where the season's basically over. I think he'll sit the full year, though, in a regular Titans year where they're playing 500 or over. But this is an interesting one. He kind of reminds me of he's like a Taylor Heineke, Carson Wentz type, where he's not going to get you a ton of numbers. He'll throw touchdowns, but he's one of those second quarterbacks, I think, in your super flex. I don't know that he'll ever be a quarterback 1, but he could be a solid quarterback 2 in one of those super flex leagues. As far as redraft value this year, I think he has none. But in terms of dynasty, I think that it's one of those picks that could essentially, I would say, it could blow up in your face depending on how high you pick him. If he's going at mid to early first, that could blow up on you. I think he's probably one of those early second rounders or one of those back end first rounders. But yeah, I think it's one of those Carson Wentz, Taylor Heineke's where he can be a really solid quarterback too. Do you agree?
Yeah, I think he's very similar to Carson Wentz. Just the size, the strength, and the ability to throw the ball. Will Levis has a lot of potential with throwing the ball. However, I don't think he's going to put up like you said, the insane numbers. He's just going to give you just enough to be a quarterback too in Dynasty. I agree that in redraft leagues, don't take him. I mean, he can sit on the waiver wire. If he comes in for a week and you need a quarterback, then you pick him up. But he has little to no value in redraft leagues. In Dynasty, I also agree with you that early second round, I think there's wide receivers, there's running backs, there's other quarterbacks that have more potential than Will Levis that can sit on your roster in Dynasty for a lot longer than Will Levis, which it could be 2-3 years maybe. We don't know the situation right now, and of course, it's a question if he's even going to fit in Tennessee right after Ryan Tannehill.
Yeah, it's an interesting one to watch. Definitely one that could be a waiver wire pickup. Again, one of the streaming options. So keep an eye on him. Let's jump back up towards the top of the draft. And another big surprise at 12th overall, Jahmyr Gibbs, taken by the Lions. They took a running back 12th overall. And we saw two of them go in the top 15, which was, an amazing surprise. And I would say that probably, to me, was the most surprising pick of the draft. What do you think?
I completely agree with you. And then we did find out a day after the reason why they weren't too high on DeAndre Swift. It seemed in Detroit. Ended up he requested a trade, and then they traded him the next day to Philadelphia. I think it's a good pick, especially with now no DeAndre Swift. This guy can fit in pretty easily into this offense. The guy that he's getting compared to a lot, Alvin Kamara. He is that guy who can be a number one back, has a lot of ability in the passing game, showed that at Alabama, but also has a lot of ability to run the ball. And they do have a power back next to him in David Montgomery now, who they picked up from Chicago. It's a good situation in Detroit. Of course, this team was a game away from the playoffs. Adding Jahmyr Gibbs to replace DeAndre Swift, I think it's a great pick, and it's a good plan for the future for Detroit.
Yeah, I think a lot of people actually pegged Will Levis to go there to the Lions, but they picked the running back, and Jared Goff has a ton of weapons now around him. He's an interesting situation. We'll see. Obviously, Jameson Williams is dealing with suspension, so he'll come back later in the year. But they'll have Frank in the year. But for now, I think that right now he has that safety plug, that Alvin Kamara, that Dalvin Cook type player. Jahmyr Gibbs definitely is a guy for me who sits right up top of those drafts, whether it's super flex or it's one quarterback in Dynasty. And he's going to be one of those, not very early, but I'd say he could probably fit into that fifth round in regular redraft leagues, depending on how people value him.
I think he could actually. I think he can be around third or fourth round, actually, Jahmyr Gibbs, just based on the situation. This offense is really good. And we mentioned Jameson Williams is not going to be there. However, these wide receivers, Jared Goff showed last year that it didn't really matter the names of the wide receivers. They would step up. Of course, Josh Reynolds. Amon-Ra St. Brown has been really good the last couple of years. But even like guys like Khalif Raymond, who you're like, oh my God, Khalif Raymond, he's now a waiver wire pickup, and we're going to put him in. He's the wide receiver 3 for the Detroit Lions, and their offense is absolutely rolling. So the biggest thing about the Lions offense was their passing game was ridiculously good last year. They put up a ton of numbers. There were so many weapons, and I think that it's really good for Jahmyr Gibbs, especially in PPR leagues as well, redraft leagues. The ability to trust a running back to get those receptions, plus getting a lot of the carries. And we'll see how him and David Montgomery mesh, who they really go with, who's the number one option, how they figure things out. But it's clear that Jahmyr Gibbs is the passing down back in this offense.
Yeah, I think it was interesting that they even signed David Montgomery back when it happened. We thought that he was going to be with Swift, and that was a good pairing as well. Then they picked Gibbs, and it was like, where do they fit? Where do they all fit? And so the trade really did make sense just because there was no room for him anymore. We heard Swift had requested the trade. And it'll be interesting to see kind of how that pairing works out. Who gets the red zone carries? I think that it's kind of that thought process that you kind of want to always have a guy who can score a touchdown in the game. So even when Gibbs is resting, Montgomery can score from anywhere. When Montgomery's resting, Gibbs can score from anywhere. And of course, I think they'll be on the field at the same time. So it kind of confused defenses. Are they going to run the ball or dish it to the guy? So yeah, it should be really interesting. But in terms of a dynasty perspective, for me in a non-super flex, he's probably the second guy on the board behind Bijan. I think that it's a guy who can be around for a while. I don't know that they're going to run him into the ground the same way that some of these other guys have been. Of course, having David Montgomery there helps his cause of not being run into the ground, getting 25 carries a game, something like that. And then, yeah, I agree with the third to fourth round investment there in redraft. Let's jump to the next one. 20th overall, Jackson Smith-Njigba, another guy who can make a big impact, but he had a weird landing spot landing in Seattle where it's kind of a crowded room.
Yeah, obviously in Seattle with Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf, it's going to be interesting how Smith-Njigba gets back from a year where he struggled mightily with injuries at Ohio State. I think he played only 2 or 3 games the entire season. So that was a struggle for him. But now going to Seattle, you mentioned it. It's a crowded wide receiver room, and I don't really know where they stand right now with Geno Smith at quarterback. Of course, he has the ability to throw the ball to really anywhere on the field, it seemed, after last season. He was finding DK Metcalf, obviously Tyler Lockett, really in stride anywhere on the field. Of course, they have a couple of good running backs, Kenneth Walker back there, one of them. But Smith-Njigba, it's definitely a weird one because he could be in the slot, but Tyler Lockett spends a lot of time in the slot as well. So trying to figure out where those two are going. Smith-Njigba is a slot wide receiver. However, you have to figure out who's going to go where with him and Lockett.
Yeah, and they might do that rotation kind of thing that, the Lions are going to do at running back, where you're going to see them, play the slot, both of them. Some of the times they'll line up wide, some of the times they'll line up in the slot. It's really going to be based off of what they see per game basis, I think. But with Smith-Njigba, you talk about the injuries, sitting out. I think that is a concern. But 20th overall, I think he was the best of those 4 wide receivers who went in a row. And so I agree with the pick. Now, in terms of a dynasty pick, he's probably your first wide receiver off the board, I would say. What do you think?
I think I agree with you. Probably mid to late first round, however things fall, really. In a dynasty draft, probably mid to late first round is a good spot for him. Probably no higher, just based on there are so many wide receivers, and a lot of them are probably on rosters already. But obviously, you take the running backs and the quarterbacks just a little bit ahead of Smith-Njigba, but clearly the number 1 wide receiver off the board in dynasty.
Yeah, he's probably right in that middle of the first round, I would say. And in those 1 quarterback dynasties, he could be a little bit higher, one of those 3rd, 4th pick, depending on how you rank the quarterbacks in that league. So we continue with the crowded wide receiver rooms at 21. Bijan Johnson taken by the Chargers, and he's got to deal with Keenan Allen and Mike Williams on his team.
Yeah, it's a tough one for Quentin Johnston, just based on he's a red zone threat type of wide receiver. I will say it helps him out that Keenan Allen is a really good slot wide receiver. Quentin Johnston on the outside, Mike Williams on one side, Quentin Johnston on the other side. I mean, Justin Herbert's going to have a field day with that, I think. I think that helps him out. Of course, though, the amount of volume he's going to get is going to be a question just based on Obviously, Eckler still in the backfield, and then the two wide receivers next to him in Keenan Allen and Mike Williams. But I think it's weird, but I think he's probably 2 or 3 on the wide receiver board, even with those guys and a crowded wide receiver room.
So it's interesting because I would say that in terms of draft, I actually would rank him fourth out of those 4 guys, just based on the situation and what he will do this season. That said, I think in Dynasty, he's probably fits in as that second guy. I think that Mike Williams' contract situation has a weird wrinkle in it where they can kind of cut him next year if they please. And that sort of kind of spoke volumes. They picked a wide receiver in the first round, might be going there and looking towards the future. So, from a Mike Williams perspective, it might be time to get off the ship. He's been injured the last, couple seasons, hasn't really been able to stay healthy. And so they take the fresh wide receiver there at 21. So that's interesting. But I would take him again. I would take him fourth out of those 4 guys in redraft, but I would take him second in the dynasty leagues. All right. Next pick was go ahead, Zach.
So I agree on that. With the dynasty, of course, like the value is there, and especially in an offense with Herbert, probably for the next 10 years. I think that's a great situation for Quentin Johnston, and I agree with you. Clearly, second. When it comes to redraft, though, I think the value is still there with Herbert. Herbert's going to throw the ball a ton. That's what this offense does. So I think that's why I'm leaning heavy towards Quentin Johnston in redraft leagues.
Yeah, well, we go to the next 2 guys. Zay Flowers was picked 22nd. Jordan Addison was 23rd. Let's start with Flowers. Flowers goes to a good situation with the Ravens. Obviously, they got their quarterback back with Lamar Jackson signing that mega deal. And now they have a wide receiver that they can kind of rely on. And as he said, let's go get paid.
Yeah. So it's a good situation for Zay Flowers. The one thing I'll say is, of course, Lamar Jackson's passing ability and the amount he goes to Mark Andrews at tight end. He loves Mark Andrews, and I think that takes a lot of value away from some of his wide receivers. Of course, Bateman's going to be back from injury as well in Baltimore, you would think, this upcoming year. And of course, they signed Odell Beckham Jr. That's another question, how he's going to be able to stay on the field, obviously coming off 2 torn ACLs. It is a bit crowded there. The one concern with Zay Flowers, like I said, though, is Lamar relies very heavily on Mark Andrews in that offense. So it could take a little bit of value away from Zay Flowers in this offense. The one thing I'll say is, in Dynasty, you would want to keep him because you know that the situation could get better over the years. But for this specific year, I think it's a little tough for Zay Flowers.
Yeah, I agree. I think that the passing ability of Lamar Jackson in the last couple of years has shown, he's not going to launch the ball every time and hit the guy in the back of the end zone from 40, 50 yards. We saw that with Bateman and kind of how his value kind of went up and down over the last season. I think that Zay Flowers might be on a rocky road a little bit. Again, I think the potential is there. He's a really good receiver. Would take Dynasty because of, who knows what's going to happen with the future of Mark Andrews. But for now, Mark Andrews is that king pass catcher over there in Baltimore. All right, 23rd overall, Minnesota Vikings. They take Jordan Addison. What are your thoughts on his situation as they move on from Adam Thielen and replace him with Jordan Addison?
So I think this is actually a good situation now because Adam Thielen is now out the door in Minnesota. Obviously, Kirk Cousins relies very heavily on Justin Jefferson. We saw that last year, and Thielen struggled a couple of games to really even get a target in the game because of how much they threw the ball to Justin Jefferson. But defenses are going to learn from that. They're going to find ways to shut down Justin Jefferson. And as much as Kirk Cousins wants to thread the needle and try and get a ball to Justin Jefferson, it's just not going to work every time, and you're going to have to go elsewhere. Obviously, Thielen is not there. Jordan Addison, I mean, he was the guy for Caleb Williams at USC. So it's a good situation, I would say, going into this year. I'm pretty optimistic on Jordan Addison and his ability to get involved in this Minnesota offense.
Yeah, and it's his ability to get open that I think that separates him. And so with Addison's case, this is where I kind of do that redraft dynasty flip where I would put him second. I would flip him with Johnston in terms of that redraft value, because I think that his situation is really great this year. He's going to be that second option opposite Jefferson. Jefferson's floor, of course, we spoke about this before. His floor is really high. However, defenses are going to collapse on him. You would assume that he's going to get double teamed a lot, and that might free Addison up. I can't really call him a sleeper because everybody really knows about him, but it's one of those targets I would have in the mid rounds of redraft. Certainly a really good dynasty pick as well, just based on the situation. And we'll see what happens with the future of Kirk Cousins as they try to look towards the future. You know, in the next couple of years, they're going to probably look to get another quarterback. It could be one of those situations like we just spoke about with Lamar, where Addison and this new quarterback could be a good pair for years to come. Now we hit an interesting case at 25 with the Bills. Dalton Kincaid, a tight end. He doesn't always play tight end. He plays the slot receiver. He plays out wide, and he also plays tight end. But they already have a tight end in Dawson Knox, right?
They do, and it was an interesting pick. It kind of caught a couple people by surprise. However, the ability of Dalton Kincaid, of course, it stood out at Utah this past year. 70 receptions, 890 yards, and 8 touchdowns. He's a really reliable tight end, and I think the Bills, if they want to have a lot of chance of finally breaking down the doors and getting to a Super Bowl, I think tight end, it was a situation that they had to upgrade on. I do think they did that here with Dalton Kincaid and being that reliable guy, that Travis Kelce kind of player that, of course, Josh Allen can go to in this Bills offense. Of course, they lost a couple guys out wide. However, Diggs is still there, and to add Dalton Kincaid to that mix, I think was a good pick by Buffalo.
Yeah, I agree. I think that Kincaid, again, he can line up all over the field. And so I don't think they're just going to use him as that straight tight end. There'll be times where he'll line up out wide. He'll line up in the slot, and that'll really free him up. Obviously, his big frame creating those mismatches against linebackers and things like that, I think will really, really help him. And being able to get out wide and create mismatches against cornerbacks who are way smaller than he is. I think it's an interesting pick for the Bills, and a really good target for Josh Allen. It's another dynasty pick that I really think probably he can slip into the back end of the first round, if not the early second round.
I agree. I think the second round probably is a good spot for him. Just based on, obviously there's a fair amount of options in Buffalo, and of course the running ability of Josh Allen. They're always gonna say, "Hey, Josh Allen, go take us to the promised land." And as much as that might be a debate for Buffalo, I do think Dalton Kincaid is a good spot for the future. In the second round in Dynasty. The one thing I'll say in redraft league, it's a little tough with rookie tight ends. I'm never a huge believer in rookie tight ends coming in right away and having a crazy impact. So I think he's towards the back half of these tight ends. However, he can slot in maybe where TJ Hawkinson, when he first came in, probably like 8 or 9, maybe 10 in tight ends. I think that's probably a good spot for him.
Yeah, I agree. I think that in terms of the rookie tight ends, they're a complete unknown. And so, yes, I totally agree. In redraft leagues, probably left off the waiver wire or late in your draft. But at the same time, if he starts to make noise, quickly grab him on that waiver wire, because, then they're just going to keep feeding him.
Yeah, I completely agree. And it's a good situation, of course, in Buffalo while Josh Allen is at quarterback.
Yeah, so let's jump over to another tight end. As the Lions, we spoke about TJ Hawkinson just a minute ago. They go and they replace TJ Hawkinson with his successor, Sam Laporta, at 34. The guy ran a 4.59 40-yard dash, extremely athletic. Are they going to be able to recreate Hawkinson, but with a little more speed?
I think they can. I mean, of course, the Lions and their Iowa tight ends, they really love them. But 4 years at Iowa, and he did a good job the last 2 years, just a reliable option at tight end. In 2021, 53 receptions for 670 yards and 3 touchdowns. A little bit of a downgrade this year, but more receptions with 58 receptions. And he only actually played 12 games versus 14 in 2021. But having that reliable guy, of course, at tight end is huge. And I think the Lions, to replace Hawkinson, did a good job in drafting Laporta, because I think he could fit in probably right away in this Lions offense.
Yeah, again, I think that's a guy who's extremely athletic. I think that's one of those guys that's probably the most intriguing of the rookie wide receivers, at least for this season, of how he can fit right in. Another guy who could fit right in is Michael Mayer, who went right in the next pick to I was going to say Oakland, but Las Vegas Raiders. And he gets to pair up with Jimmy Garoppolo.
Yeah, and it's a weird situation, obviously. I believe Darren Waller's out the door. Am I correct on that?
Yeah, he was traded to the Giants.
He was traded to the Giants, exactly. So with Darren Waller out the door, of course, now they replace him with Michael Mayer, who a lot of people even had Mayer going into the first round and being drafted as the number 1 tight end over Dalton Kincaid. Of course, he slips into the second. The Raiders are all over it, and they have a tight end now for the future in Mayer, who had an impact at Notre Dame and is a reliable guy. Another one, tight end who can slot into this Raiders offense pretty quickly with Jimmy Garoppolo at quarterback.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see how, from the Dynasty perspective, where guys rank Kincaid versus Mayer. I can make the argument for either guy, but they're probably right neck and neck.
Yeah, I think the one thing about Mayer's situation is now with Garoppolo. Garoppolo is the kind of quarterback who likes to check it down a lot. And I think obviously Josh Jacobs is still going to be there. And of course, now with a tight end in Mayer, I think those two can get a lot of volume in that offense. Like I said, because Jimmy G is not the kind of guy who's going to throw it 60 yards downfield. He's going to keep the offense moving and 15 to 17 plays on a drive and try and get into the end zone after that.
Yeah, it's actually funny that you mentioned the checkdowns, because, when he was with the Patriots, Gronk had a ton of points from him that season, and he gets traded. And of course, George Kittle's value absolutely skyrocketed based off of his ability to throw right to him. So it'll be interesting to see how he works here with Michael Mayer and whether Mayer gets a ton of targets early. So we bounce around a little bit. Let's just talk about a couple of the wide receivers that went a little later. We talked Jonathan Mingo went to Carolina, Rashee Rice went to the Chiefs, and then Jalen Hyatt went to the Giants. Which one do you want to start with?
I mean, we could start with Mingo, because we've talked about Carolina already and the offense with Bryce Young. Obviously, DJ Moore is in Chicago. They traded him for that number 1 overall pick. So that's a question now for Carolina, who can kind of replace DJ Moore. Of course, they picked up Adam Thielen in that offense. However, Jonathan Mingo, the rookie out of Ole Miss, he can fit into this offense right away. And of course, I really do like when a rookie quarterback comes in, they can pair with a rookie wide receiver. I think they can kind of relate to each other, how they did in really a college football standpoint. now and translate that into the NFL.
Yeah, and it's almost like they're learning together, right? I think
Exactly.
that's something that's absolutely crucial for a quarterback to be able to say, hey, I can, I'm in the same boat as you. So I think Mingo's an interesting one, a guy to keep on your radar there in Dynasty, probably not in redraft, but he could be a waiver wire pickup later down the line. Rashee Rice, let's move over to him as the Chiefs move up to grab him. And their situation's a little interesting. They lose Juju, and now it's really Darius Toney, Sky Moore, and now Rashee Rice.
Yeah, it's interesting because they have these really young wide receivers who could have a huge impact in their career. They might not. However, with the Chiefs, they're going to throw them in different situations. The Chiefs are the kind of team that have 5, 6 wide receivers that they're going to throw to Patrick Mahomes, and they say, here, just throw to this guy, figure something out. So it's interesting always with Kansas City. You can't really rely too much on the wide receivers like they do on Travis Kelce. But Rashee Rice he had an unbelievable senior year, almost 100 receptions at SMU, almost 1,400 receiving yards, 10 touchdowns, stood out. And it's just another weapon for Mahomes. It's interesting when it comes to Dynasty and redraft leagues, just because I mentioned the Chiefs have so many wide receivers that you don't know who's going to be powerful in the next 3 years or so, or who's going to be low down or maybe even be out the door in the next 3 years.
We saw that with Sky Moore last year, where everybody was very high on him, and he really didn't do much. He was returning kickoffs, returning punts, and he had a couple catches. And so it's the unknown. But Mahomes said it last year. He's going to spread the ball. He admitted it, and then he did. He spread the ball, and so it should be an interesting case to see what happens with Rice. Probably one of those mid-round flyers in one of those rookie drafts. And again, one of those waiver wire guys, I would say, or very late in your redraft league.
Yeah, I agree with you. And it's just a name to watch out for, keep an eye on, because we almost expected it with Sky Moore. Okay, he's going to go crazy at the end of the season, or you're going to hold on to him, and nothing really happened. However, that option kind of returns now, and it could be Rashee Rice.
Yeah. Now, before we get to Hyatt, I want to talk about Jayden Reed, who got picked 50th overall by the Packers. They lose Aaron Rodgers, and they finally get weapons up early in the draft, which was quite honestly hilarious, just from the standpoint of that they never would get Rodgers any weapons, and now all of a sudden here they are. What's your outlook on Jayden Reed and how he might compare to Dobbs and Christian Watson out there?
So this is interesting because, Reed's not the guy that stands out too much in college football. He didn't stand out too much in college football a year ago. He had a pretty good season in 2021 with 59 receptions, over 1,000 yards and 10 touchdowns. But then he also has the rushing ability as well. Maybe some jet sweeps here and there. So some trickery in that offense. I do think right now he's probably behind Watson and Dobbs because they've been in that offense for a year already and kind of know what to expect. Watson, in my mind, is clearly the number one guy in Green Bay, of course, with Lazard out the door as well. I do think Watson's the clear number one. I would put Dobbs at number 2 just because he knows the offense and what is kind of expected from Matt LaFleur. But the other thing now with Reed is they just add another option. I don't think he's going to be too impactful, but he could just be that third guy in the wide receiver room that can help out Jordan Love, who's still trying to get used to an NFL offense, an NFL game, just trying to get used to being there.
Yeah, I agree. I think that for Watson's case, he was coming in as the one. Obviously, he was hurt early in the season, and so he kind of became number 2, even 3, with Lazard obviously was still there. And so for the situation that Watson found himself in, he kind of up the board on the depth chart. He ended up becoming, now he's the number 1 receiver, I would say. And then it's, Dobbs is probably in that number 2, and Reed's coming in as the number 3 with the potential to go rise above Dobbs. I'm not sure he can yet. He still needs to kind of prove himself. And, it's interesting to see what happens with Jordan Love, and Aaron Rodgers like to always his favorite targets and kind of stick to them, which is why guys like Randall Cobb stuck around with him because they knew they were going to get the ball. And so we'll see what happens with Love, whether he can figure out who his guys are and who he's throwing to the most.
Yeah, I agree with you. And trying to find that kind of reliable target, I think, is the biggest thing for Jordan Love coming into this Green Bay offense for really the first time. Of course, he came in here and there when Rodgers was out for a game and struggled because obviously it's his first couple of games. He doesn't really know too well. Of course, he's been learning. However, I do think it's been deflating for Jordan Love the last couple of years just to be sitting behind Aaron Rodgers. He was drafted in the first round. Love, of course, that was a debate of if he should have even been drafted in the first round. But he's just been sitting there for a while and trying to learn, but also trying to keep a positive mindset that, yeah, I can be an NFL quarterback and I'm not going to just sit here as a backup. So that for his confidence, I think finding that number 1 guy, I think it's Watson, but it could be any of the other guys, especially some of the guys that Green Bay just drafted.
Yeah, let's move right along as the Giants at 73. They picked Jalen Hyatt. They haven't really picked any receivers that high. Sterling Shepard was hurt. They bring in Darren Waller, and now they kind of have a 1-2 punch, I think, in Hyatt and Waller.
I agree with you. The one thing I'll say about Hyatt is I feel like he's more of a deep threat than anything. So that could be a little bit deflating for redraft and dynasty because he, of course, it's a little bit different with an offense like Cincinnati where Jamar Chase, yeah, he's a deep threat, but he also can be a guy that checks down. I think Jalen Hyatt needs to do that more, especially to fit in with Daniel Jones in this Giants offense. But it is so crowded with wide receivers that have been injured, wide receivers that are just hanging around there. You don't really know where Hyatt's going to be in this offense. Of course, Isaiah Hodgins had an unbelievable season last year and now could be just hanging around. Darius Slayton was there last year as well. But there's a bunch of names, Wan'Dale Robinson, Sterling Shepard. You go down the list. It's hard to find a spot right now for Hyatt. However, if he wants to be the number 1 guy, I do think he needs to look to be a little, he needs to check down a tiny bit more rather than being that deep threat like he was for Hendon Hooker at Tennessee.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of what made Wan'Dale Robinson really attractive for the Giants when they picked him, because he not only can go deep, but he can do those slant routes. He can come across the middle. He can do button hooks and things like that, where his route tree is so large that they can get him the ball in any kind of situation. And so I agree, he's going to have to do more than just being that deep threat. But if he does, then, the Giants will be able to throw the ball as Danny Dimes improved a ton last year compared to what he was the first couple of years of his career.
Yeah, I agree. And we saw a new Daniel Jones, of course, with the rushing ability. We mentioned it before. So that's also going to be something to watch out for in this Giants offense. Is he going to be throwing the ball as much? When is he going to be throwing the ball? And also, can he link up with a guy like Hyatt who wants to head deep? I mean, he at Tennessee last year, of course, he had 1,200 yards on 67 receptions, That's 18.9 yards per catch. So he's gonna have to figure out how to fit more as a number one guy in a check down type of wide receiver, but also figuring out what Daniel Jones really is looking for in this offense.
Yeah, so now we go to the second tier quarterbacks that got picked. Some of the guys that were more touted, could have been like early, but also might have been mid. Hendon Hooker was a guy that picked at 68 by the Lions. There were reports that he could slip into the back end of the first round, early second round. He goes 68 to the Lions. And then Stetson Bennett, he goes 128 to the Rams. Do either one of these guys have any value in redraft or dynasty?
So I don't think any value in redraft. I think that they're going to be the backup, especially Stetson Bennett more than Hendon Hooker. But even Hooker's situation, obviously Jared Goff's the guy, and the Lions have shown that it's probably not going to change until something happens, maybe a mess up, a blip here or there from Jared Goff, and I don't think that's happening anytime soon. With how Jared Goff played last year, and how he's probably going to continue to play under Dan Campbell. The thing about Hooker is the ability to really do everything. Of course, now it's a little bit of a worry. He injured himself and was out for the rest of the season, and obviously that's why he dropped so far in this draft. But the talent is there. I don't know how much the injury is going to affect him in the future, because that's something to watch out for. In Dynasty, I think they could probably be maybe a QB4 right now. Just a guy you stash on the bench, maybe here or there. You kind of figure something out in the later rounds of a Dynasty draft. But nothing more than that this year.
Yeah, I agree. I think that with Bennett's situation, I don't think that he's going to be this, but I think both of them have no redraft value. So I'll make that clear first. But with Bennett's dynasty situation, I mean, we talked the longevity of Matt Stafford, the health, and he's the backup right now. So, there's the possibility that if you're in a deep league, you do flyer on Stetson Bennett just to be able to have him stashed on the end of your bench. And in the case that Matt Stafford does get hurt, maybe comes in and he's that Brock Purdy kind of role, got picked late in the draft and makes a huge impact. As far as Hooker's situation, interesting. We spoke about the weapons that the Lions have now and how they'll probably be improved this year. And so if that's the case and Goff plays well, then, I think Hooker's going to probably be the second string again next year. And because he wasn't a first round pick, he doesn't fit a fifth year option. Half of his contract's going to be over by the time he could even be a starter. And you also talk his age, he'd be 27 by then. So it's one of those dynasty picks that you probably have to pick him a little earlier just because of who he is, because another team probably is going to take him first. But it's also one of those picks that could blow up in your face and be one of those waste picks, sort of kind of like how Malik Willis was, where the talent was there, but he's not really going to get the opportunity. And with Malik Willis, it still remains to be seen whether he'll get an opportunity elsewhere, not in Tennessee. But with Hooker, his age, being 27 and being able to get a starting role, definitely hurts value.
Yeah, I agree with you. The age is something to look out for. I mean, really for both of these guys, because the age is up there. Of course, they played a lot of years in college. I think the value clearly is higher for Hooker than it is for Bennett. However, you did mention that Bennett's the backup right now, and obviously, all of a sudden Baker Mayfield was coming in when Matt Stafford was down, and last ditch kind of option. And then Baker Mayfield ended up being the number one guy for the Rams to end the season. So it's an interesting one for Bennett's situation. But I don't think there's too much dynasty value. I think there's a lot more for Hooker. Like you also mentioned, the name. Of course, people know who Hendon Hooker is. the season he had at Tennessee until the injury, it's going to be somebody to watch out for. But like I said, not till really a little bit later in dynasty drafts.
So now let's talk about some crowded backfields. Roschon Johnson gets picked 115 with the Bears. Interesting situation there with Khalil Herbert. Zach Charbonnet picked 52nd by the Seattle Seahawks. Interesting situation there with Kenneth Walker. And then the Jets taking Izzy Abakanya at 143. Interesting situation there as well with their crowded backfield of Breece Hall and Mike Carter. So which to you has the highest value of the three, and which to you probably is not for you?
It's definitely a tough one because, of course, Seattle has Kenneth Walker. So he's probably going to be the number one guy for a while now, you would think, in Seattle. For the Jets, they have a backfield that's full of solid running backs now. Of course, Breece Hall is ahead of the game, ahead of Abanikanda. The Bears is an interesting one, of course, without Montgomery now, and with Herbert as the lead guy. I think Johnson probably has the best value right now because of the situation. And just based on the other two teams with Seattle and New York, they have their lead guy and they're very young and they have a lot to bring in the future. So most likely Johnson, I would say is the top guy right now, I would say, especially going into this year.
Yeah, I think that I agree. Johnson definitely has the highest redraft value for me, just based again on that situation and how teams like using that 1-2 punch. And with Charbonnet, it's a little interesting because he's the kind of guy that has a similar skill set to what Kenneth Walker was doing. And so it'll be interesting to see how Pete Carroll uses both of them. From a dynasty perspective, Charbonnet has the highest value for me just because he's the best player available. But don't discount Roschon Johnson just in terms of that role and the impact that he could make. As far as Abanikanda, it's an interesting one because he was a guy who could score from 50, 60 yards out regularly when he was over at Pitt. And now he's in a situation where Breece Hall, we're unsure. Reports seem to be that he's making progress on the coming back from the knee injury. But in the case that something does go wrong, they have that option. So a guy to keep an eye on, maybe one of those late round dynasty picks, or one of those guys that you kind of, watch on the waiver wire in case something happens.
Yeah, I agree. And you mentioned Charbonnet. He's clearly the number one guy of those three when it comes to dynasty value. Of course, he went to Michigan at first, didn't end up panning out. And then he went to UCLA and put up two monster seasons in the Pac-12 as the lead running back for the Bruins. And the ability that he has as kind of a power back is definitely stands out to me. Of course, he was more involved in the passing game last year at UCLA with 37 receptions out of the backfield. So that's something to look out for. The one thing I'll say is if Kenneth Walker does go down, I think Charbonnet has a lot to offer to Seattle over a guy like DJ Dallas, who's going to be there. Of course, Rashad Penny's out the door now. So DJ Dallas is probably the second or third guy with Charbonnet. If Kenneth Walker goes down, Charbonnet is going to be a weekly pick for a really solid running back for Seattle.
Yeah, I think he'll be a monster, which is why I would recommend that if you are in a redraft league, probably take Charbonnet late in your draft just to have him on the bench in the case that it something does come about. I think like an Alex Mattison situation where we'll talk about him in a minute. But one of those situations where if Dalvin wasn't playing, well, then you knew Mattison was going to score a ton of points.
Yeah, I completely agree. And having that like stash guy on the end of the bench does not hurt you. It actually helps you more often than not.
So let's talk winners and losers of the draft from a perspective of guys who, kind of did the whoof and got away with their position not being picked.
Yeah, and there's a bunch of guys that really stand out. Of course, Isaiah Pacheco is a big name because I had him in a redraft league, and he was actually very reliable. However, there were so many options in that Chiefs backfield that you didn't know what he was going to do. I think the Chiefs are the type of team, like we talk about, that add a ton of guys and just hope that one is the next Travis Kelce. In that case, whether it's wide receiver or running back. So I think Pacheco is a big guy that probably won it for me.
Yeah, I agree. I think for me, it definitely comes down to, I would say, Desmond Ridder is a guy, and Sam Howell is probably another guy. Two teams where they were really looking at taking a quarterback, and the last couple of years, this situation with the quarterbacks was interesting, and both teams came out and immediately said, no, these are our guys. I think that if you own either one of those two guys in Dynasty, you were really happy with the fact that neither one of those teams took quarterback, and those two guys will likely be the starters.
Yeah, just young guys that can really fit in now with nobody in there, and it's their job, and it's their job to lose. Hopefully, they take it and they can roll with it throughout the season.
All right, so now we move over to the biggest loser. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that Kenneth Walker is probably our biggest loser.
Interesting. Why do you say that?
Well, I think that again, he could be the number one guy. I think that a lot of those carries are going to be taken away, though. I think that he made it very well clear that they're going to fight for their roles, and that he said it in that way. So I think that Charbonnet actually has, a decent chance of taking out a chunk of those, I'll say, red zone carries. And it could really limit the way that Kenneth Walker produces those numbers like he did last year in terms of the touchdowns.
That's fair. I think for my biggest loser, of course, the obvious name is Tyler Algier. Obviously, Bijan Robinson coming in. Algier's value is probably next to gone for now, unless something happens to Bijan Robinson in that offense. I do think Rashad Bateman will take a big hit, of course, in that offense, not just because of Zay Flowers, but also because of Odell Beckham Jr. And obviously, depending on his health, if there's a bunch of names there, Rashad Bateman, who was injured for a while, I think he does take a hit. And of course, I have Rashad Bateman on my dynasty team, and it's not going to be a easy season for Bateman. He's going to have to really fight for points there and volume in that offense, with also, like I mentioned, the amount that Lamar relies on Mark Andrews at tight end.
Yeah, we spoke a little earlier about Mike Williams. He's the guy that I have on my team. And so his outlook on his future, I took Quentin Johnston 21st overall. And so what his future might look like, it looks a little bleak for Mike Williams. And then Dawson Knox, another guy that, it looked like Dawson Knox was like that reliable guy. And now we're not so sure.
Yeah, I agree with you. And Kincaid is, I think he's going to end up taking over Dawson Knox's role. I think he's going to be the number one tight end just because his athletic ability and what he can bring to the Bills offense is just a little bit different from Dawson Knox. And Dawson Knox, over the last couple of years, was kind of really only a red zone threat more than anything. I think Kincaid all over the field can be a threat in this Bills offense, and that's what makes him stand out over a guy like Dawson Knox.
Yeah, and I think the draft stock also helps too. Not that draft stock is meaningless out in San Francisco the way that they are talking about Brock Purdy versus Trey Lance, but at the same time, I think that the draft really does help in this situation at tight end. So now we spoke a little bit about Mattison a little while ago, and now we get reports that came out about Dalvin Cook and what his future might look like, that they might cut him, what ripple effect this could have around the league as Dalvin Cook, joins the running back room that looks like it could have been set. And now all of a sudden there's Dalvin Cook in your locker room sitting with you. And what could it do for Alex Mattison?
So this is interesting because Mattison, of course, has been a stash type of player for the last couple of years, behind Dalvin Cook. Always a guy that, okay, if Dalvin's going to get injured or he's out a game or two, which has happened a lot in the last 2 seasons, Mattison has stepped in and he's an automatic top 10 running back. That's just how it works in the Minnesota offense. If Dalvin is maybe out of Minnesota, I think Madison's value pretty much skyrockets, because he's going to be the lead guy. He's been in the offense for a number of years already. He's been behind Dalvin, and he's even taken a lot of carries away from Dalvin in certain situations. I've been a Dalvin Cook owner in redraft leagues, and it is a bit of a struggle sometimes because all of a sudden Alexander Mattison is getting a goal line carry. And you're like, where is Dalvin Cook? So this has been a situation that's been interesting over the last couple of years. But like I said, if Madison's the number one guy in this offense and Dalvin Cook is cut by Minnesota, his value is, I think, top 10 running back easily.
Yeah, I mean, he really proved to be that when Cook was out. And so for me, if Cook is cut, Madison's going to be one of those guys that in redraft league, he's picked pretty early. He's going to shoot up boards as, the draft season kind of goes on as we get closer to the NFL season. It's an interesting case in Dynasty, though, where Cook, his value is kind of dipping a bit. He's still Dalvin Cook, but his value is dipping just based on these rumors that he may not be there. And you have Madison, his value is going up. So what do you recommend owners to do of buying, selling, or holding either one of them, and what they might be able to get if they decide to sell?
So this is tough for Dalvin right now. Of course, for Dalvin owners, because you don't really know what's going to happen. Because in the end, he could stay in Minnesota. That's still an option. Of course, these are rumors. They're not. They might not entirely be true. So it's an interesting situation right now. For Dalvin owners, I would see if anybody's maybe interested in him. See what kind of value you can get for him right now. However, I would probably hold on to him because I don't think you're going to get a ton of value for Dalvin Cook with these rumors swirling around. I don't think anybody's going to give up anything massive for Cook. With those rumors that he might get cut, I would say probably keep him for now. And I do think he still has the ability to be a running back in the NFL and fit into an NFL offense that might not be in Minnesota. The question is, do you want to wait for that and see where he's going to end up landing? Because it might not be the greatest option. The one thing for Madison is there's a lot of good situations out of this for dynasty owners. Of course, if you have Mattison, you're going to probably want to keep him if he's going to be the number one guy. Even if you have some pretty good guys ahead of him, there's always flex spots, super flex spots that you're going to throw Alexander Mattison in, and he's going to get you the points that you want. So I'd probably keep him. Of course, the value is going to be up. You could shop him a little bit, but I don't think you're going to get anything close to what you're looking for with that much confidence right now. But I do think Cook owners, you probably stay put right now, and I would probably say the same for Madison owners.
Yeah, I think for both cases, you kind of have to hold unless you're blown away by either package, knowing that Dalvin's value is kind of tanking a little bit and Madison's value is going up a bit. If you get one of those offers that you just are like, how is this guy offering me, a top 10 talent for Alex Mattison? You have to take that, obviously. And with Dalvin, it might be the same where, how is this guy offering me a top 10 talent for a guy that's probably not going to be here very much longer? I think that otherwise you probably hold in both cases.
Yeah, and like we said, if you're offered a guy like Najee Harris that's going to be good for the next couple of years, yeah, you're gonna think about that. With either one of these guys, the looking at both of them, I agree. It's just holding right now until you find out some more information. And if the information comes out that Dalvin is going to get cut, then you start to think about making a move.
It should be interesting to see. A bit of a longer one for our first episode here. We went about 90 minutes here. We'll try to keep it a little shorter on the next one. We're going to do our next episode is going to come out in a week. We're going to talk NFL or NFC free agency post draft. It's been a little bit clearer of a painted picture. And then we'll follow up, of course, with the AFC as we head closer to the NFL season. It's getting closer, Zach.
Yeah. I mean, we're counting down the days. They're almost there, and then of course, fantasy football dynasty drafts are coming up soon. So keeping an eye on those as well.
Yeah, and we'll be able to get guys mock drafts as we get closer to kind of get you guys set up for both redraft and dynasty. And until next week, I'm Brett Malamud along with Zach Malamud. This has been Third Round Reversal. We will see you guys next week.